to have our keynote speaker here today. I'm a little bit of a fangirl. To be honest, I contacted her with sort of a fairly narrow margin of hope that she would be able and want to come on Pioneer Day to speak to us. So I'm really excited that she's here, and I can't think of anyone else that I would rather hear from on Pioneer Day than Lindsay Hansen Park. Lindsay is a women's rights activist, a feminist blogger, and an advocate against gender violence. She co-founded Utah for Congo to raise awareness for post-rape survivors, and she's currently heavily involved in the Mormon feminist movement. Lindsay is the assistant director for the Sunstone Education Foundation and the founder of the Feminist Mormon Housewives podcast, including the internationally acclaimed Year of Polygamy series. She blogs for feministmormonhousewives.org about women's issues. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, the Los Angeles Times, and many other Utah publications. She and her family live right here in Salt Lake City, where she raises 3 beautiful kiddos, gardens, and rages against the machine. She will speak to us for about 20 minutes, and then she'll go directly into a 10-minute Q&A. So while she's talking, if you think of questions you'd like to ask her at the end, that would be fabulous. Please welcome Lindsay Hansen Park.
Without the mic, should I use the mic? Use the mic? Okay. Okay, can you hear me? Any art fans out here that can recognize the artist on this screen? Nice. Okay, yeah, it's Jackson Pollock. I want to tell you, just as an aside, one of the most powerful lessons I had as an undergrad at Utah State was about this painting. Now, our art professor held this painting up, and he told us the story behind the painting, which is basically Jackson Pollock was a little boy on a canoe with his brother in a lake, and it was stormy. They knew they weren't supposed to go out there. They went without their dad's permission, and the boat sank, and Jackson watched his brother drown. And so the black represents the sinking feeling as he watched his little brother drown and he couldn't save him, and the yellow represents the light of being pulled up in the water. And as our professor told us this story, he told it in such great detail. We felt such great emotion. I think a few of us were crying as he was going on in great detail about the story. And at the very end of the story, the professor said, actually, I don't even know if Jackson Pollock had a brother. I made that story up. And we were like, what? What? We were so confused. And he said, our job here as artists is not to care what the painting is about. Our job is to look at the technical aspects of the art. Why he painted what he did, why he put the color where he did, look at the composition and things like that. And it was such a powerful lesson for me on critical thinking. And while I realize that history is a completely different discipline than art, I think it's an important story because sometimes when we see pictures of things or portrayals of things, we have a certain idea of what those things represent, and we attach meaning to those things. And had my professor not told me the end part, or if I had to go to the bathroom and walked out, I would have gone on thinking that this was about the death of a person that never existed. And I want to talk about how that relates to Pioneer Day. Now, I'm so glad that I was asked to speak on old-time polygamy because most of the work I do now involves current fundamentalists, which is fascinating. I mean, the stories there are absolutely fascinating, but it was a pure joy to dig back into this history. Unfortunately, doing so means that I went down 1,000 different rabbit holes, and I have hundreds of stories in my head that I wish I could tell, so I'm going to move really, really fast today to get out all these stories. There are some really good stories here. But I want to tell you the story about the Mormon family. Now, Utah is known for family values, right? That's something we pride ourselves in. We base our laws and we base a lot of our culture and a lot of our traditions around family values. And of course, if you're like me, family values in Utah meant Mormon family values. I grew up in the Mormon church. And so for me, family and Mormon were combined. They were inseparable. So I want to talk about a Mormon family, a Mormon pioneer family, and I want to talk about family values. And just like the painting, I want to think about what we see when we think of the Mormon family, when we think of pioneers, and when we think of Pioneer Days. And we're going to talk about some of the things that were happening on this day. Now, as you know, today is Pioneer Day, and the very first Pioneer Day, does anyone know what year that was? Anyone? It is not on here. No. No. It was actually 1849, so it's 2 years after the pioneers arrived. They actually waited till the last saints that had actually lived in Nauvoo arrived to Utah. They didn't call it Pioneer Day at the time. They held it in what was called the Bowery on Temple Square. So it was like sort of this makeshift tabernacle that they had on Temple Square. At 7 a.m., they awoke the entire town with cannon fire and martial music. It was very militant, they had militias walk up and down the street. They played the bugle, and they erected a big liberty pole, kind of like a maypole in the middle of the town, and that was their first celebration of Pioneer Day. And they had 24 bishops representing 24 wards march down the streets with weapons, and 24 women carrying a big sign that said, "Hail to our chief," meaning Brigham Young. So that was the first Pioneer Day. Now, we don't have the picture of that, but I did find some fun pictures. This is one of the earlier ones we can find. This is 1880. This was a parade where they make this cute little float. They built a cabin and took it down Main Street. This is a famous one. In 1897, they actually were starting to get more diverse. So they asked the Chinese community who were here for the railroad to participate, and they actually built, you can kind of see, a white dragon coming down the streets, and that was the one that was known for a long time as a parade to remember. And we have a lot of pictures from the 1912 parade, but here in 1912 they're recreating dressing up as pioneers, as we are wont to do. And so Pioneer Day becomes this reenactment of the pioneers entering the Salt Lake Valley. Now I want to talk about the most influential Pioneer Day, I believe, in history, and that's the Pioneer Day of July 24th, 1857. That's where our Mormon family story begins that I'm going to tell you about. And here we have Brigham Young Hampton and Bertha King. And for the sake of this story, because there's a lot of Brigham Youngs in this story, I'm going to call him Hampton and Bertha. So Brigham Young Hampton, he's a really interesting man. He is not related to Brigham Young, but Brigham Young actually wanted to marry his mother, Julia Foster. Julia turned Brigham Young down and instead married Jonathan Hampton. But Brigham Young got the last laugh. He was able to name Brigham Young Hampton. He named their firstborn, and he named him after himself, Brigham Young. And when Jonathan died, Brigham Young had Julia Foster sealed to him for time as a plural wife. And she actually ran for a short period of time the Lion House until some sort of unknown scandal, and she was kicked out and sent on her way. But Brigham Young Hampton would be closely associated with Brigham Young, almost as if Brigham Young was his father. And here we have Bertha King, which is his first wife, and she is the daughter of Hannah Tatfield King, also sort of a daughter of Brigham Young in a strange way, because her mother was a polyandrous wife to Brigham Young, which meant her father was a Gentile. He was a non-Mormon living man, came to Utah with his wife Hannah Tatfield King, but Brigham Young sealed himself to Hannah so they could all get into heaven. So they're all kind of related to Brigham Young in some sort of way. Now, these two newlyweds had been married just a year, and Bertha was 7 months pregnant when she and her husband Hampton made the 2-day trek up Cottonwood Canyon to Silver Lake. You guys all been to Silver Lake? Nice picture of Silver Lake. Now, many people don't know that the Pioneer Day of 1857 was spent on the banks of Silver Lake. The event drew over 2,500 people. They used 464 carriages and wagons, 1,028 horses and mules, 332 oxen and cows, and it took 2 days to go up the canyon. And then what they did is they set up all their old pioneer crap. They set up their tents and their horses, and they camped out. It had only been 10 years since they had arrived in the valley, and they wanted to recreate this. So they dressed up as pioneers, and they went up the canyon and camped out. They had a party on the banks of this lake. They had brass bands, athletic events, drills by the militia members, dancing, and they fired the howitzer cannon. And then from the two highest peaks, they dropped a gigantic American flag. According to Orson F. Whitney, who was the historian at the time, he said, quote, On July 23, 1857, the pioneers assembled to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the entry into the Salt Lake Valley. The grand celebration took place on the banks of Silver Lake at the head of Big Cottonwood Canyon. Many left their homes and traveled on horseback or in vehicles to Silver Lake. It was a merry sight to see them come, wagons loaded with camping outfits, bedding, provisions, and human beings of all sizes and ages. They talked of old times at Kirtland, Nauvoo, and winter quarters, spoke of their trials in the subduing desert. They pitched their tents on the banks of the lake, 3 spacious boweries with plank floors and erected by the big cottonwood lumber. At sunset, the bugler summoned the campers, and President Brigham Young addressed them. President Kimball dedicated the spot for the celebration the next day. Then some retired, but many danced the evening hours away. The next morning, on the 24th, the Stars and Stripes were unfurled from the summits of the 2 highest mountain peaks that surrounded the lake. Prayer was offered, the choir sang, and the cannon roared, the bands played, and the military performed. There was dancing, boating, picnicking, playing games, climbing hills, strolling, or resting under trees. At this very time, the Mormons were falsely charged with being in the state of rebellion against the United States government, and Johnson's army was leaving for Utah to stop the rebellion, end quote. So that's Orson Whitney's account. Now, according to historian Bob Floodline, he said that Orrin Porter Rockwell, are you familiar with him? He is one of the wildest characters of the Wild West. Picture a real outlaw, and he was Brigham Young's right hand, I would say left-hand man. So they're all having this party, and Orrin Porter Rockwell comes riding dramatically in during the very height of the celebration, and he tells them that the U.S. President James Buchanan is sending federal troops. They're on their way now to, quote, put the Mormons down. Brigham Young gets up in front of the group and he says, "God is with us and the devil has taken me at his word," and the crowd had a thunderous applause. And Brigham said, "In 12 years, I will either be president of the United States or dictate who will be." History's funny, huh? So now, it's impossible to convey the panic that these people would have felt in 1857 Utah. I would need far more than 20 minutes to do that, and we could talk for years about 1857 and the things that led up to that, one of those being Mountain Meadows Massacre, which is directly affected because of this Pioneer Day. This is why I say this Pioneer Day is very important. It leads to the massacre. It leads to the Utah War. It leads to a lot of the development in Utah. One of the things that it leads to is what is called the Mormon Reformation. It's all kind of tied in with this, and I'm going to talk about that for a minute, because this event changes everything for the saints. But I want to talk about for a second why pioneers, as we know them, had to go dress up like pioneers and pretend to be pioneers 10 years after they were pioneers. I want to think about that. I want us to think about why they were doing that. I like to think of this as like one of the first treks. You know, Mormons still do the treks. They recreate the handcart treks. This is literally what they were doing. They needed a reminder of what had brought them here. They needed a reminder of what it felt like to be unified. So why would they need that? Why would they need such thing to recreate so in such short time? Now, enter stage left. We have Jedediah Grant. He is, in my opinion, one of the most chilling characters of frontier Mormonism. Has anyone ever heard of him? I'm so excited to tell you about him. Okay, he is the father of Heber J. Grant, who was a Mormon prophet. Now, Heber J. Grant got lucky because he never had to be raised by Jedediah Grant. He was 9 days old when Jedediah passed away of pneumonia, which I think he got off easy, because Jedediah is something else. When you picture some guy out of Hollywood who is a religious zealot, you know, to the extreme, someone who has religiosity, who is very orthodox, someone from the Salem witch trials, this is your guy, Jedediah Grant. In 1854, Grant was ordained an apostle, but he did not become a member of the quorum of the 12 apostles. Instead, he had a special calling. He was called to the first presidency as President Young's second counselor, filling the vacancy led by the death of Willard Richards. So he was right up there with the three with Brigham Young, and he was Brigham Young's right-hand man. Now, Jedediah would use his power to completely transform Mormonism, which completely transforms Utah. Now picture, before this Pioneer Day in 1857, in 1855, Mormon Utah is starving, okay? This is where we've all heard the story of the seagulls and the crickets. You know, we all hear that in school. It's a very beautiful story. There is a huge drought that swept through the land. The pioneers are no longer on the trail. They're trying to survive in the Great Basin Desert. They have instigated and sometimes been the victims of many Indian conflicts. They joined up with Chief Wakara in stripping Navajos, Utes, Paiutes, Bannocks, and Shoshones of their lands through violence and sometimes very manipulative means. And Chief Wakara is another Hollywood character for you. He ran the Great Basin with the fear of a dreaded and violent mob boss. He would spare no one, mothers, women, children, to get what he wanted, and he was BFFs with Brigham Young. Those two worked really well together. So the people are starving, struggling to survive, and starting to apostatize within 10 years of the Saints getting here. Threats of the government taking over is looming, and Brigham Young needs a way to unite the Mormons. So historian Steve Taysom claims, quote, "The Mormon Reformation should not be interpreted primarily as a response to an organic spiritual crisis. Rather, it was the intentional creation of a crisis by the church leaders in an attempt to reinvigorate Mormon communal and religious identity at a time when the Mormons were between periods of major crisis with the outside world. The Mormon Reformation stands as a synthetic crisis implemented by LDS leaders to reinvigorate reliance on the LDS church leaders among rank-and-file Mormons at the time when external crises were absent." This is where Jedediah, who is dubbed Brigham's Sledgehammer, steps in. And we have in 1856, 57, 58, what we call the Mormon Reformation, and he's the key figure in this. This is just an example of one of his sermons. This is where Jedediah claims that Jesus was crucified because he was teaching plural marriage, which I love. So this is like a PG version. If you go through the journal discourses, you can read terrifying sermons from Jedediah and Brigham Young during this period in the Mormon Reformation. This is when blood atonement rhetoric starts popping up. This is when miscegenation rhetoric starts popping up. This is when we see Jesus as a polygamist rhetoric start popping up. It's crazy. This is when the church really starts to sort of resurrect, if you will, the idea of the second coming, that it's looming and it's coming again soon. Now, most Mormons believed it would be in 1897, but Brigham Young starts using rhetoric. Actually, he uses the most millenarian rhetoric in this time than he does anywhere else, that the world is going to end and you got to get prepared. And so he does this, and Jedediah Grant says, quote, "The church needs trimming up, and if you will search, you will find your wards contain branches which had better be cut off. The kingdom would progress much faster, and so will you individually, than it will with those branches on." And here's where we see what we call Utah culture or Mormon culture begin to develop. This is where neighbors began to be actively encouraged and actually institutionally supported in policing and watching their neighbors for what they do. We see the invention of what we call home teachers, who start in the form of 2 missionaries per ward. They are given a list of questions similar to Temple Recommend questions that Mormons get today that develop into 27 catechisms to ask every single Mormon. And now these missionaries would go to your house. They would take every individual man, woman, and child and separate them in a room, and they would ask these 27 questions. And these questions didn't focus on what you believed, more about what you do. Things like how often you bathe and how often you attend church. And this makes church attendance mandatory. People were actually, at this time, afraid for their lives if they didn't attend church on Sunday, whether they believed or not, whether they were Mormon or not. In fact, if you wanted to live in Utah and you weren't Mormon, you had to Mormon the way the Mormons were doing it, even if you didn't believe. Now, Hannah Tapfield King, who is the mother of Bertha, who I showed you earlier, was 49 at the time, and she describes the ordeal. She says, quote, "The bishop and at least 2 teachers went around and catechized the people in every house, taking some members in separate apartments. Then they proceeded with me. It began, have you committed murder, ditto, ditto, adultery, ditto, ditto, robbed, spoken slander of your neighbor, broken down your neighbor's fences, brought your children up in the principles of righteousness, etc. It was over a foot in length. Blessed were those who could answer in innocence." Now, during the Mormon Reformation, crazy stuff happened, and I'm talking crazy stuff. So the LDS sacrament is taken away because the people are too wicked. It's returned after a 6-month hiatus. They give amnesty to all sins, like a total amnesty, as long as you're willing to be rebaptized. They rebaptize everyone, including the whole territorial legislature, just baptize them in City Creek all at once. Jedediah Grant gives a 3-day fiery sermon, and he gets people in the tabernacle so whipped up that they're confessing their sins, literally screaming their sins at one another, convulsing, whipping people with branches and reeds, and it was terrifying for those who were there. They had people confessing to murders they didn't commit, to whoredoms they didn't commit. They were beating each other up, throwing people through windows. It was nuts, okay? Picture the fervor of the Salem witch trials, except for in the tabernacle. Now, this is where we see Hampton and Bertha, because they're our Mormon family, and they were right there for all of this. They were there for that famous Pioneer Day. They were there for the Mormon Reformation. In fact, Hampton gets rebaptized in the summer of 1856 in City Creek. He also takes Bertha into marriage, and he would start taking plural wives. Now, in the Mormon Reformation, they say about 65% of all Mormon plural marriages happen within these 2-month periods. It was like pumping out marriages left and right. Now, I want to talk about Mormon sexuality for a minute because it doesn't resemble at all today what it did back then. It was a lot more fluid. By the time Hampton had married Bertha, Bertha was 21. She had already been married once before as a plural wife to someone. It didn't last very long, and she was divorced. Bertha would have many, many children with Hampton, but became dissatisfied when he took his second wife, Helen. She would eventually leave her children and marry a Gentile and move to Nevada. And let me see, I got to move on. So Bertha ends up with 3 sexual partners in her lifetime, which is not uncommon at all, especially in the pioneer times. I want to talk about his second wife, Helen. Now, Helen, the day he gets sealed to Helen, Bertha is there. She is at the ceiling across the altar, gives Helen away to her husband. Her husband, Hampton, goes to meet her for their wedding night, and instead he finds a note saying that she's run away to Montana with a Gentile. So he's like, dang it. So he starts to take Bertha down to southern Utah, and on their way there, he's met in the street a week later by an impoverished, ragged-looking Helen who is crying in the street, literally begging him to take her back, saying he made a mistake. He said, I'll think about it. And she shows up in his life a year later, pregnant, and a month later gives birth to a daughter, which Hampton claims as his own. He takes her back into his graces. She starts having kids for him. So now we have wife number 2, who has fluid relationships with other people, and of course that's not something we think we would see now. Now, things go really south for her once he takes her to a ball. The next night he takes a woman named Mary Jane Robinson to a ball. Helen shows up at the ball, creates such a scene that they actually have to leave the ball. These two have to leave the ball. But no matter, he marries her 5 days later as his third wife. Now, Helen freaks out about it. She freaks out so much that she meets him in the street. She scratches his eyes. She tears his clothes. This would happen for about 10 years in their marriage. Conflicts, abuse. She charged him in bishop's courts over and over and over again. He shows up in probate's courts for abuse. Actually, Hampton tries to divorce Helen. Helen will not divorce him. It's clear that she's in love with him, but she's really distraught by this. Now, Hampton, I show a brothel because I want to talk about this Mormon family. Hampton is this upstanding man in Mormonism, and in Utah, there's this fight between prostitution and polygamy. The Gentiles are saying the Mormons are immoral because of polygamy, and the Mormons are saying the Gentiles are immoral because of prostitution. Hampton ends up in this whole mess. Because first, Hampton is accused of murdering a Dr. Robinson. Dr. Robinson was a Gentile who married a Mormon woman, which you don't do in 1850s Utah, ends up murdered. Hampton takes the fall for it, is then in jail, And he actually thinks at one point that Bill Hickman, another one of Brigham Young's henchmen, is going to kill him to take the fall for the murder. He's actually worried that Brigham has sent Hickman to kill him. But eventually, the charges are dismissed, like these things seem to have happened, and Hampton ends up in the good graces of Brigham Young again, where he has deeded some property. Hampton leases the property to two German brothers on Commercial Street who open up a brothel. So technically, church property is hosting a brothel. And this doesn't look good, and so they decide to shut down the brothels. So Hampton is now made the head of police, chief of police, and he organizes a sting where he and 20 ward missionaries will spy on some prostitutes that they have planted into the brothels to tempt non-Mormon, anti-Mormon men into the brothel. They watch through a hole in a wall, and they do these stings. Eventually, Hampton gets caught back in it. He gets indicted. He gets thrown back in prison. All the while, we have Helen and Mary coming and visiting him in prison. Helen is very angry at him. Mary is very submissive and supportive. And Bertha, the first wife, is now taken off to marry her husband. This is a picture of a brothel. So anyway, the long story short, when we think about pioneers, I want us to think about what we really know about pioneer families, what we know about families today. We like to think that we know the history of pioneers. And you know, it's stunning to me. I think about this idea of what we think pioneers are. The Pioneer Parade where they have the covered wagons and these beautiful floats. And I think about these people doing the exact same things. And here they are portraying pioneers that not even they were at the time. And it blows my mind to think that they recreated pioneers that didn't even represent who they were. So what do pioneers really mean? What do families really mean? What do we know about our pioneer history? Those are the questions I want you to ask on Pioneer Day. Okay, any questions? I hope that made sense. I just breezed through it all. Questions? Yes.
At that 1857 it sounded very, very patriotic.
Yes.
And I also remember about the saints and Brigham thinking they were setting up their own country, having their own language, which doesn't seem so patriotic. So does that change over time, or is it just tensions that were there?
No, it's very interesting. So the Saints actually celebrate the 4th of July. They never stop. And in fact, this is why we have, still today in Provo, they sort of split it up. Provo celebrates the 4th, and Salt Lake has Pioneer Day. They kind of did it that way on purpose, so they each took turns. It was always a scene of sort of patriotism, which is interesting because you're right. When the Saints left Nauvoo, they thought they were leaving the United States. They actually did leave the United States into Mexico. But it's a sort of blurry 2 years where they think that they're, for a time, setting up their own country, basically, the state of Deseret. Now, what is happening in the meantime is there's correspondences going back and forth across the country about the status of their territory, and the majority of the Saints don't get any of that until everything is set in stone and implemented later. So during this period in 1857, there is this idea that they are celebrating their own independence from America, the oppressors, but they're also sort of celebrating their founding fathers. So they believe they're taking the real America with them, if that makes sense. And yet it's not clearly distinguished and talked about who the bad guys are and who the good guys are, because as we see, Brigham Young thinks he's going to be president of the United States again. Joseph Smith ran for president of the United States. So they have this interesting tension where they both hate the government and love the government, if that makes sense. Well, those actually never stopped. They actually evolved, and they developed into temple recommend questions over the course of a long, long time. And that's why we still have home teachers, which stemmed from this. But actually what happened as a result, as they sort of cramped down on this, there are other ththings going on. One of the things I skimmed over is there was an actual very public lynching related to the murder of Dr. Robinson. They believe that Thomas Coleman, he was a slave, possibly a slave, definitely a servant to Brigham Young and Brigham Young's nephew, who was the mayor of Salt Lake City. They thought he knew too much, and he ended up being blood atoned, found on the top of Arsenal Hill, which is by Capitol Hill. They cut symbols of the garments into his body, and they literally they pinned onto his skin a sign that said, "A notice to all N-words, leave white women alone." And they blamed him flirting with white women on the fact that he knew a lot about Dr. Robinson. Well, this and Dr. Robinson meant that government pressures were cracking down. So while I can't emphasize enough how much Brigham Young and all of these church leaders were involved with this. This is a national thing. So they're dealing with that, and while they're dealing with that, they sort of have these home teachers keeping everything in order in the wards, if that makes any sense. And so what you start to see is really extreme radical people like Bishop John Snow, who's castrating people in southern Utah. Extremists that are going crazy starts driving people away. So either people are scared now into submission, or they're driven away. And even Hannah Tapfield King, who was married to Brigham Young, still to Brigham Young, she thinks it's too much. She criticizes it. She actually writes a poem in a publication, I can't remember the name of the publication, that kind of mocks this. So there is this idea of dissent, and this is where I like to say, like, we have some progressive Mormons sort of come out of the woodworks and try to push back against this. So the rhetoric gets softened, but it never goes away, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, so I would say they are inclusive as far as it represents their worldview. So when I say inclusive, we start to see in the 1880s, they're like, oh, I want to express my heritage of my motherland. So we see a lot of Scottish and Irish, and they did find a certain fascination with the Chinese culture and the Japanese culture that existed on the outskirts. They were nearly invisible. They also sometimes forced indigenous participation, or if they couldn't get indigenous participation, they dressed up as Native Americans themselves. And there's a story of a Native American actually watching the parade from a tree, and he fell out of the tree laughing so hard because it was so ridiculous, the portrayal. But I did find some pictures in the 1880s. It said, like, proud Indians walking in the parade, and it was very much like a costume thing. So I think this idea of inclusivity that fits our worldview is pretty consistent.
So I've always been curious about the economics and the costs behind polygamy, because my understanding is that the church was nearly broke at the time that Brigham Young had dozens of wives, and I imagine the cost structure and expenses of supporting those wives is significant compared to what you have.
Yeah, Jesse Embry has actually done some in-depth there are actually a few great articles on the economics of polygamy, but I will say that this is why we see the United Order tied with polygamy. Those who don't know about the United Order, it's basically communism. Most historians would not like that comparison, but that's the easiest way to describe it. Communalism is another way to describe it. Brigham Young actually tries during the Mormon Reformation to institute the law of consecration. He actually puts up $199,000 of his own money towards it. And it's this idea that if you share property, you share everything. And it was one of his ways to sort of institute a way to help the starving saints. This is on Brigham Young's mind. People are starving, including some of his wives. Brigham Young would go on to live in wealth, but at the time, I mean, he certainly lived better than the majority of the saints, but he wasn't, by his own standards, wealthy. Brigham grew up really, really poor, and so wealth is something that's on his mind. So if you look at Heber J. Grant, he had 34 wives. Those women starved. Their children starved. They were destitute. Heber tried to provide for these women, but when you have 34 wives and you're not very successful at making money yourself, those women are going to struggle. In fact, a lot of women divorced Heber because of this. A lot of them leave when the soldiers come. This actually inflames a lot of the conflict we see in the 1857s when, before Johnston's army comes, we have the Steptoe expedition, and there's actually a riot in the street with 100 Mormon men and 100 soldiers. They're going to have a showdown in the middle of the street over the soldiers taking away the women. And actually one of Heber Kimball's wives leave with the Steptoe expedition, and you see Mormon rhetoric towards women start to really go downhill, that Mormon women are, I would call it slut-shaming. It's like, you know, women can't be trusted, women are terrible, women are sexual, and before that, we don't see that rhetoric. I don't know if that answered your question. Any other questions? Sorry, can't hear you. I think the difference was a lot of them had the clothes that they actually wore when they came across the plains. And so a lot of them had militia uniforms that they would dress up in. So while it could still be the militia uniforms that they used, it was sort of, they were trying to recreate their days in Nauvoo or their feelings of persecution in Nauvoo, if that makes sense, Nauvoo and Kirtland in Missouri. So a lot of these people had participated in a lot of the conflicts. Even Hampton here, he was involved in the Nauvoo Legion and some of these things we call the Danites. He was involved in a lot of the violent stuff. So he would have had a lot of his sort of memorabilia and things like that. That makes sense. Any other questions? Really quick, since I work for Sunstone, I have advertisements for our conference this weekend, and I've brought some polygamy issues. These issues are specifically about polygamy. It's a premier issue, and it has a bunch of polygamists written for it. So if you want one, you can grab one.